The Florida Emergency Air Base hadn't seen a single aircraft leave the ground in nearly 4 hours. The storm front had pushed inland, fast flooding back roads and grounding even the newest jets lined up across the concrete. Inside the control tent, screens blinked static, and the air hung with the hum of generators trying to stay ahead of the heat. By the fuel depot, a battered seaplane sat in the runoff, its faded silver hull streaked with old salt. No markings, no listed flight number. Just one woman tightening her vest straps with deliberate, practiced movements. Her boots were already soaked through. Her name wasn't on the roster. No one had checked her in. Wind gusted hard across the tarmac, flipping a caution sign onto its side. Inside the command center, no one looked up. They were too busy recalculating routes and watching Doppler feeds. No one noticed the silhouette walking past the hangar's clipboard tucked under one arm. Eyes scanning the sky the way some people check for traffic. Claire didn't pause when she reached the ladder. She climbed with sure-footing fingers moving easily across the worn metal handholds. Inside the cockpit, everything smelled like old canvas and fuel left too long in a hot tank. She adjusted the seat, checked the straps, and rolled up her sleeves. Outside, another jet crew canceled their departure. One of the officers radioed in a weather delay with the same flat tone used for lunch orders. But near the edge of the runway, a low growl began to rise. Claire's plane came to life, its engine sputtering, then catching, then finding a rhythm that didn't belong to any official schedule. No one waved her off. No cameras followed her ascent. The wheels stayed down for just long enough to clear the soaked grass at the runway's edge. Then they tucked up silent and sure. The gray plane lifted into the sky like it knew where it was going before anyone could ask. Claire Jensen lived in a converted trailer just past the southern fence of the emergency base. It was parked beneath a pair of wind-warped pines, the kind that bent from years of storms. The siding was patched with tin, and her clothesline always held at least one uniform shirt drying in the sun. She was 42, and looked like someone who didn't count birthdays. Her hair stayed tied back with the same faded bandana, and her hands were always stained with oil. People on base passed her daily but didn't know her name. Claire's mornings started before the sun. She heated water on a propane burner, drank tea from a tin mug, then walked the gravel path to the hangar. No one walked with her. Her plane, an old seaplane named Dolly, had once belonged to her father. He'd flown routes no one else would take, delivering medicine to backwater towns and guiding survey teams into marshes too dense for road crews. Claire grew up in the co-pilot seat, learning altitudes by the sound of wind and pitch by the tone of an engine under strain. She knew where storm tides crept in before satellite updates ever arrived. Now she kept Dolly running with salvage parts and long hours. She wrapped worn cables with cloth tape, replaced rusted bolts one by one, and kept a handwritten log of every adjustment made in pencil on graph paper. No one had ever asked to see it. At the base, Claire was listed as a local contractor unofficial support. That meant no credentials, no clearance, and no place in the command center. It also meant she never got in the way. She'd been at the base for 6 weeks when the rains hit. The big teams arrived with fresh gear and corporate patches. The mood was tight and professional, all briefings and buzzwords. Claire watched from the sidelines, mapping the coastline shifts from memory. She didn't interrupt. She just marked the flood rise and traced drainage paths with a grease pencil on a plexiglass panel salvaged from an old storm chopper. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. Her tools were arranged by use, not brand. A rusted screwdriver shared space with a pressure gauge from the 70s. Each had been wrapped in cloth, packed in a roll she stitched herself. She wore the same boots every day, soles reinforced with tire rubber. When they squeaked from water, she dried them by the lantern near the fuel drum. Her hands moved without hesitation, never fumbling, never wasting a second. People thought she was quiet because she had nothing to say. That wasn't true. Claire simply knew most people weren't ready to listen. The day before the last drop mission, she had offered to update the forecast overlay. She had noted 3 places where the floodplain had changed shape. The officer she told never even looked up from his screen. Claire folded the update and tucked it in her flight vest. That night, she traced the storm edge with a flashlight, pacing the field like someone testing wind direction by instinct. Her path made no noise. Her map made no demand. She just watched the sky shift. Nobody told her to prepare. She had already done it. Not because she was assigned, because she knew someone would have to try. The recognition never came. The clearance never arrived. But Dolly had been fueled, strapped, and trimmed for wind. Claire never chased approval. She chased safety. She carried memory, not rank. And when others hesitated, she simply moved forward. The command tent looked like something built for war, not weather relief. White vinyl walls stretched tight around rows of folding tables, each lined with black monitors and blinking status lights. The hum of fans and generators kept the air sharp and dry. People moved with clipped precision radios clipped to vests, badges swinging from branded lanyards. Most wore pressed uniforms or matching team shirts, the kind with embossed logos no one questioned. Their eyes stayed on screens, fingers tapping at digital maps and forecast overlays with the ease of habit. Screens dominated the front wall, one for each sector under surveillance. A large red band swept across the southern region, pulsing with updates pulled from satellite relays. Every route was measured, logged, and time-stamped in real time. No one asked about instinct. No one checked outside. Decisions were built by data, charts, percentages, clearance levels that could be printed and reviewed. In the center, a colonel with spotless boots stood beside a magnetic board filled with color-coded flight paths. His voice carried clearly across the space firm, but rehearsed. He listed numbers, confirmed launch windows, and gave nods to people whose names were stored in spreadsheets. A media rep hovered near the edge of the circle, her tablet already midstream with the press outline. She adjusted lighting angles and asked for wide shots without background clutter. Words like optics, exposure, and credibility floated just under the surface. Behind her, a crew from logistics monitored the drone feeds. Their display cycled through topographical scans and air corridor simulations. One mentioned thermal drift at the ridgeline, but the data didn't support a redirect, so nothing changed. Every decision followed protocol. Every move was expected. There were no allowances for improvisation. A tech officer updated the wind profile and layered it over the terrain model. Another team measured cargo balance down to the gram. Everything worked on code, not memory. Accuracy came from input, not experience. None of them looked tired. None of them looked scared. The mission had been built like a machine, precise and planned to the second. But the storm wasn't listening, and no one seemed to notice that. Claire's corner of the base sat just past the main gravel path where the newer equipment stopped, and the concrete showed cracks from years of storms. Her seaplane rested beside a rusted hangar, its faded paint dulled by salt and sun. No one parked near it. The hangar door leaned crooked on one hinge. Inside a workbench held a tin box of tools wrapped in cloth, each piece labeled in her father's handwriting. A fold-out chair stood near the wall, its fabric sun-bleached and thin. She kept her maps on a board made from an old door panel, corners weighted with rusted washers. Each route was drawn in thick pencil, marked by memory, not GPS. Small notes curved along the lines. Safe drift floodgate. Weak brake line. Low. The others didn't ask what she was doing. They walked past without comment. Eyes ahead. Boots clean. Claire never interrupted. She moved through the space like it was part of her. She could reach any tool without looking, feel the wind, and know if the tide had shifted. Her notes were written on the backs of old supply lists and clipped together with binder rings. Nothing she owned matched. Nothing was new, but everything worked. She stored spare cables in coffee cans and kept rain tarps folded beneath the seat of the plane. Her fuel gauge was a notched rod she dipped by hand. The cargo net was patched with wire she'd twisted herself. Every part of her routine ran quiet. She knew which bolts needed retightening after rough landings. She could read the sky by the way birds flew or how the trees tilted just before a gust. No one asked where she came from. No one asked why she stayed. But she had been there the whole time, steady as the old hangar wall behind her. The air in the briefing tent felt too still for how much motion was happening inside. Crew members clustered around tablets, eyes flicking between forecasts and flight logs. A large display showed the projected drop zones blinking red at every section marked delayed or uncertain. Claire stood just outside the circle. She held her map in both hands, the paper worn at the corners, lines thick with pencil marks. Her voice was low but firm as she stepped forward and pointed to a narrow bend along the coastal ridge. She said, the water channel had shifted south since last season. The storm had moved the breakwater in by nearly 30 feet. She traced it with her finger, then offered the map for someone to see. No one reached for it. The colonel didn't look up. A young pilot with a flight suit zipped halfway down glanced at her clipboard, smirked, then looked away. He said something about tourist souvenirs under his breath. A few others laughed quick and light, trying not to make a scene. Claire didn't react. One of the media coordinators walked by and asked if she could step back, said they were lining up a wide shot. Her tone was polite, but her eyes didn't land on Claire once. She waved vaguely toward the back of the tent. Claire lowered the map slightly but didn't move. She said again that the southern route was still passable. The wind would push the current there if it shifted again. Another officer finally turned and asked if she had any satellite confirmation. She said no, just field checks and elevation records from the last 3 runs. The colonel still hadn't spoken. The young pilot chuckled and asked if she'd done that with a yardstick and a notepad. Someone added that the air corridor had already been approved by tech. There was no need to revise based on guesswork. Claire didn't argue. She folded the map in one careful motion and tucked it under her arm. The clipboard stayed in her hand. No one thanked her. No one asked her name. The group reformed like she had never spoken at all. A new call sign was issued. Timelines were adjusted. The discussion moved forward without her. The only thing left behind was a damp print of her boot near the edge of the mat. The morning sun hadn't cleared the clouds when the manifest check began. Names were read from a clipboard one after another, each pilot nodding in response. Claire stood quietly near the edge of the pad, her flight vest zipped and map tucked tight under her arm. A junior officer with pressed sleeves looked up at her. He scanned the page, then shook his head without apology. Said she wasn't listed. She asked if there was a note, a late edition, anything missed. He said no. No manifest slot, no clearance code. Behind them, a crew adjusted camera rigs for the media group. One of the coordinators walked past Claire tapping a headset and said they needed her moved back for visuals. Clean angles, no background bodies. Claire stepped to the side without speaking. She didn't argue. Her hands stayed at her sides. A drone buzzed overhead. The pilot teams gathered near their assigned crafts, their vests marked with agency tags and sponsor patches. Someone called out final checks. Claire stood in the space between the activity and the silence. She was close enough to see the flight plans taped to the command tent wall, but too far for anyone to include her. The list had been printed without her name. The younger pilot with the polished boots passed by, threw her a half smile, and said something about too many eyes and not enough wings. She didn't respond. Her face didn't change. The flight crew moved into formation. Orders were repeated through radios. Claire folded her map, turned toward her plane, and walked away from the group like she hadn't been dismissed. Just left out. Again. Claire moved around the seaplane like someone stepping through memory. Every motion had weight but no waste. Her hands found each latch, each cable with the kind of certainty that only comes from years of repetition. She started with the pontoons, checking tie-downs, sliding a flat bar beneath each strap to feel for softness. The hull gave just enough when she leaned into it, but it held firm. That was what mattered. Inside the cockpit, the air smelled like canvas old rain and the faint sting of fuel. She sat in the pilot seat for a moment without touching anything. Just listening. Her father used to say the plane would tell you what it needed if you listened with your palms. She pressed hers lightly to the side panel. The metal was warm and quiet. She pulled out the tool roll from beneath the seat and unwrapped it with care. A cloth pouch stitched by hand held pliers, a dull-edged screwdriver, and a small wrench with initials carved in the handle. None of it looked new, but every piece worked like it was meant to. The throttle guide slid too loosely, so she oiled the track and tested it again. Better. The left radio dial was loose, its cord worn, so she replaced it with one from her spare kit. No checklist told her to do this. She just knew. The altimeter still had a crack across its face, a scar from a storm run years ago. It had failed on her once over the northern Keys. She kept it there anyway, not as warning, but as reminder. Back when she was 12, her father let her guide through fog using nothing but cloud weight and wave pitch. He talked her through it, but his hands never touched the controls. That was how she learned to fly. She remembered the hum of the engine and how he would listen with his eyes closed to find where the pressure changed. He taught her to trust the pull of the wind and the tone of the engine before any screen. The sky, he said, would always whisper before it shouted. She wiped down the console with a clean rag, brushing dust from gauges and checking for looseness in the anchor screws. Nothing moved that shouldn't. Nothing stayed still that needed to shift. By the time she reached the loading bay, the light had begun to shift. She lifted the crate marked water with a steady grip, braced it against the side, and tied it down with a double loop knot. The rice pack came next. nested tight and secured with a cargo net threaded through anchor points. She'd replaced herself. Last came the crate marked antibiotics. She moved slower with that one, not from fear, just from care. The hatch latch was stiff. She leaned into it until it gave with a low snap, then slid the crate inside and padded it with folded life vests. Each tie-down was checked twice, not because someone told her to, because she knew that if anything slipped mid-flight, she might not have time to fix it. She stood at the edge of the bay and exhaled, not in relief, just rhythm, the same way her father used to breathe before lifting off. There was no countdown, no command, but Claire knew what came next, and her plane was ready. Claire unfolded the old map across the narrow bench near the cockpit wall. The paper had yellowed at the edges, creased in places where her father's hands had pressed it flat. Pencil lines traced river bends and ridge cuts like veins familiar and worn. She studied the section near the southern shelf. The waterline had changed again after the last storm, pushing in deeper toward the low ridge. Her fingers moved over the page, slowly mapping it again from memory. She could picture the curve clearly in her mind. A narrow passage that held steady even when the rest flooded. It wasn't on any digital chart, but she had seen it twice on foot and once from the sky. She picked up the grease pencil from its magnet clip. The metal clicked softly as it came free. With quiet care, she drew a line that curved gently along the lower path. The pencil pressed firm and clean dark against the faded paper. She paused at the bend where the channel met higher ground. In neat block letters, she marked it, "Safe Water." She didn't write anything else. No dates, no explanation, just the label. Her father had told her once that a good mark didn't need to shout to be useful. She set the pencil back in place and ran her palm once over the map. It rippled slightly under her touch but didn't tear. The canvas had held up through years of storms just like the plane. Carefully, she rolled the sheet into a tight scroll. The edges lined up the old paper, still crisp enough to fold without cracking. She wrapped a rubber band around it twice and slipped it into a waterproof sleeve. That sleeve slid into the side pouch under her seat. She zipped it shut with a steady hand. Her father's route. Her update. Their map. Claire sat back for a moment and looked toward the hatch. Light filtered through in soft streaks touching the edge of the bench. The air was still warm from the afternoon, and outside the wind pressed just enough to rustle the tarp on the wing. She didn't speak. Didn't need to. The route was marked, the point was clear, and her hands had done the work. If anything failed, this line might be all she had to follow, but it would be enough. Inside the command tent, the air had shifted from confident to brittle. Screens that once buzzed with colored overlays now flashed alerts in rapid sequence. The storm front had thickened, moving faster than forecasted, pressing down on every projected route. One of the junior officers tapped a headset, listening hard before shaking his head. First team pulled out. Visibility dropped under safe limits and crosswinds made the corridor unstable. A second call came in minutes later. Turbulence had knocked a camera rig off axis and the pilot couldn't get a clean approach. They circled once, then headed back. The colonel's jaw tightened. He looked at the screen but didn't say anything. His hand stayed on the radio mic, but he didn't press the button. The media rep whispered with someone from the logistics side. Their tablet glowed with a drafted statement already being revised. Infrastructure delays review for safety postponed efforts. Soft words to explain a hard stop. At the back of the tent, a tech clicked through drone feeds, but the image kept stuttering. No signal past grid echo. The southern sector was just static and shadow. A younger pilot stormed in with his helmet still under one arm. His flight suit was wet along the sleeves and his voice pushed too loud into the space. No visuals. Crosswind tore the ridge open. Couldn't hold a line. No one argued. No one asked him to try again. The room had gone too quiet. A logistics officer leaned in toward the map table. 3 aircraft were grounded. Another was rerouting. The last had stalled, waiting for confirmation from the southern gate. The colonel finally gave the call to suspend. Ground remaining crews, cancel the final wave, review forward staging overnight. The order was simple, but the silence that followed made it feel heavier. People stopped moving just for a beat, then quietly began to pack up their gear. No one made eye contact. No one wanted to be the first to admit they hadn't seen this coming. The system had been perfect on paper. The problem was the weather hadn't read the schedule, and now the window had closed. The footage arrived just after 6. A volunteer from a nearby village had walked it through rising water to the field post. It was a phone cracked at the corner, its screen flickering with static and raindrops. A translator handed it over, breath short from running, and said, "Someone needed to see this." A technician wiped the device clean with his sleeve, plugged it into the display cable, and waited. The screen blinked twice, then filled with a shaky image. The first seconds were hard to read. The phone shook as the wind screamed across the mic. Rooftops slid by in blur, then steadied. A wide sheet of gray sky came into view. In the distance, a small plane cut across the clouds, low and slow. It wasn't part of any listed fleet. Voices rose in the background, too soft to catch. Then the camera panned hard left and caught the moment. A crate dropped from the plane's bay landing square on a blue tarp held tight by old tires. There was no music, no commentary, just the sound of rain and the whir of propellers fading as the plane lifted away. The room in the command tent went still. Someone leaned closer. Another officer whispered that it couldn't be real. The technician slowed the video. They all watched again, more carefully this time. As the plane banked over the roof, its tail dipped just enough for the number to flash once in the frame. Black on gray, no insignia. Silence settled deeper. No one spoke, but their eyes stayed locked on the screen. The younger pilot who had bailed hours ago stepped closer. He didn't look at anyone, just stared. One of the command staff checked the manifest again. Page after page scrolled past with no mention of Claire. She wasn't listed on any departure log. No one had signed her out. The translator said the village had waited all morning. They had assumed no one was coming. Then they saw her. In the final few seconds of the video, a child's hand entered the frame, reaching upward. The plane faded into the mist behind it. No ceremony, no signal. Just a gray wing gliding through the clouds like it had always known the way. And the crate had landed. The supplies were there. She had made it. No one had cleared her. No one had followed. But she had gone anyway, and she had done what no one else could. Claire's plane touched down just after sunset, gliding low across the still wet strip at the far end of the base. No one was there to mark her arrival. The control tent lights flickered faintly in the distance, and the last shift change had already passed. The pontoon skimmed through a shallow pool left by the earlier rains. The propeller slowed its rhythm, easing into silence. She coasted to the edge where the gravel met the concrete and let the weight of the aircraft do the rest. Claire opened the hatch and stepped out without hesitation. Her boots landed softly on the float, soaked from the ankles down. The sky above her had turned to a soft blend of amber and slate. No one called her name. No one was watching. She climbed down, using the side frame, skipping the bent ladder like she always did. A tech moved in the distance, hauling cables toward a drone rig, but he didn't look up. Claire didn't wave. She didn't expect him to. She walked the length of the aircraft, checking the tension on the straps that had held the last crate. The space was empty now. The cords curled slightly from where the pull had been. She closed the bay door and latched it by hand. The metal gave with a quiet click, soft enough not to break the air around her. She paused, pressed her palm to the hull once, then turned toward the hangar. The light inside was dim. Her tarp was still folded on the bench, untouched. She left her boots near the door and peeled off her damp socks, placing them beneath the edge of the lantern to dry. She didn't speak. There was nothing to say. The flight was over and the work was done. Outside, the last drone tower blinked once, then faded. The base settled into its nighttime hum. Claire stood still for a moment and let the quiet wrap around her like it always had. There were no announcements, no reports filed, but the route had been flown, the crates had landed, and the sky had let her through. Claire stepped into the hangar and let the door swing shut behind her. The air inside was still holding the scent of damp concrete and old oil. Her footsteps echoed lightly as she crossed the floor toward the map board. The map was exactly where she'd left it, pinned flat against the crate wall with thumbtacks and wire. She unhooked the grease pencil from the nail above and found the curve labeled Safe Water. Her hand moved slow but steady, tracing the familiar bend. She added a single mark beside the label. A check. Nothing more. The graphite line was clean, dark against the paper aged by years of handling. She stepped back and looked at it for a moment, head tilted, breathing even. That spot was no longer just a guess or a hope. It was proven now. Claire set the pencil down and turned toward the small table near the back. Her kettle still sat on the burner, dented at the base but reliable. She filled it with bottled water from the crate, twisted the knob, and waited for the flame to catch. Outside, the wind had dropped. The flaps on the tarp no longer moved. The hangar felt like a pause after a long exhale. She leaned back against the bench, fingers resting on the edge, watching the steam rise. It coiled in lazy loops, warming the air around her face. The lantern beside her buzzed gently, casting soft shadows across the ribs of the roof. Her mind wandered to old flights. Nights spent beside her father in this very hangar, watching him grease joints and mark maps by hand. He used to say the sky didn't need to know your name. It just needed to trust you to come back. She poured the hot water into her tin mug, cupping it in both hands. The warmth reached her fingers before the steam reached her face. She didn't drink right away, just held it. The logbook was still in the drawer beneath the chartboard. She pulled it out, flipped past old pages with notes in two sets of handwriting, hers and his. She found the last page and wrote one word: complete. She slid the book back into place and closed the drawer without sound. Outside, a bird stirred in the rafters. Somewhere, a drone tower blinked once and went dark. Claire stood and walked back to the plane. Her boots left faint marks across the dusty floor. She reached out and laid her hand against the hull, fingers spread wide, the gesture simple and sure. Thank you. She didn't need to say it. The touch carried everything. She stepped back, eyes scanning the aircraft one last time. Then she turned off the lantern and closed the hangar door behind her. The click of the latch was the only sound left. The work was done. The route had held, and no one needed to know for it to matter.